seems to me that I've seen a great number of programs with you presenting the past, history, archaeology, walks. I mean, you name it, you've done it. What do you think of as some of the key skills for that process?
Uh, Liking it, loving it, being passionate about it, wanting to do it. Um, when I was a little boy, I was born in 1946, so it was just after the war had ended. My mum and dad had both been in the war. My dad was in the RAF, my mum was in the WAF, and neither of them had what you'd call a great war. You know, they didn't win medals or anything, but it was the time of their life. They were young, working class people, suddenly meeting people from everywhere. So from as early as I can remember, I got stories about the past, my mum and dad's past. And I realized, by the time I was about 4, that the time that I lived in was not the only time there'd ever been. And if, by implication, there'd been a time when my mum and dad were young, there must have been a time when their mum and dad and their mum and dad and their mum and dad and their mum and dad had been young and were doing all these things. And that has always been as much part of whom I am, that perception, as breathing is, as snogging is, as listening to music is. I never thought of history as a subject. And so and I'm in my late 30s by this time, when I was suddenly asked to make a documentary for Comic Relief, first time I'd ever done anything like that, I just fell into it. It was just where I wanted to be. And having been an actor for the previous 24 or 25 years, because I started as a child actor, it was also something of a liberation. It meant I could use a lot of those skills that you acquire as an actor to do with trying to find the light. I hope hope the light's on me, right? Knowing how to be alive, knowing why and when you need retakes, knowing how to share the passion inside you, kind of with your face and the words, and knowing to do that 5 or 6 different times because you need the retakes, all those kind of things. I could pour those into talking about the past, talking about people's experiences, and it was a great blessing to have discovered and found something new.
Did you ever have a sensation? I occasionally get this. I mean, as you know, I'm an old hippie, so you might expect this. But were there some periods of history that you felt sympathetic or attracted to, or almost like this was a period of history that you found so fascinating, there must be more to it than just a simple learning about the past?
The simple answer to that is no. The simple answer is I see myself as a storyteller, and there are wonderful stories in every part of history, in the most tragic parts of history, in the most obscure parts of history, just as there are in the most familiar ones. Having said that, of course, there are 2 or 3 moments in history, like, round about 32 to 34 AD in Jerusalem, that I would love to go to see exactly what was happening. Like I've always been fascinated by King Alfred and the digs around King Alfred's days in Somerset, which we did very, very early on in Time Team, really touched my heart, because I had always thought to myself, how did a bloke who was never meant to be king, because he'd got 5 older brothers who were all trained up for the job, get to be king, and then when he was, turn out to be one of the most fantastic kings in our history, who kind of created England as we know it today. So I feel quite contradictory about that. Sorry, that was a very simple question, and I gave you a very long and boring answer.
I love the long, boring answers. It wasn't boring at all. But we're finding, as you said, to an extent, we don't often get a chance to have a chat like this. Yeah. I mean, if the cameras weren't here and we had another bottle of wine, this could go on for a long time. But
all these are things that you and I think and have traded in ever since we've known each other, but hardly ever need to say to each other.
The thing I like about this way of going at the past is that Alfred, who you've just mentioned, has a connection with the Sutton Hoo Boat documentary that we're doing, in that Alfred had a dream There is a sequence called Alfred's Dream in, I think, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in which he imagined what kind of boat would defeat the Vikings, long time after Sutton Hoo, 300 years or so. But there was something that Alfred saw, that a big boat could actually defeat the Vikings. And the nice thing is that the Sutton Hoo boat is actually earlier than some of those big Scandinavian boats. And history's like that. I still get things. I'm not really a historian, but somebody tells me something and I just think it's so exciting. I have to tell everybody because I didn't know about it. And I think that's lovely. Were there things that suddenly came out? What revelations have you been part of in your journey through the periods of history? Which was the moment when somebody opened the grave or suddenly revealed something?
One of the most interesting things about history to me is it's a bunch of lies. The fact is that virtually everything that has been written down, almost up till now, indeed up till now, isn't the objective truth. It is always written by someone with a vested interest. Someone who has been paid to puff a particular king or queen, someone who wants to justify a particular massacre, someone who wants to say, my religion is better than someone else's religion. So you can never really touch the objective truth. In a way, maybe there isn't such a thing as the objective truth. Modern day physics would seem to imply that that's the case. But just occasionally, you hear a voice and you think, I understand that voice. I know that voice. And I feel that about King David in the Old Testament. I feel that about Odysseus in the Homeric Odysseys. I feel it about Hamlet. I certainly feel that about King Alfred and his biographer Asser. And there are just moments where you get something out of the ground. I can remember you and I were in Shropshire once, and there were two bits of wood, and we found that they actually linked together. And then we noticed that there was the same letter on both sides of the joint. In other words, a carpenter had cut those two things. They were meant to be one joint, but they might get lost, so you had to autograph them, and whoosh, we slotted them together again. And suddenly, all the guff of history disappeared, and I was touching a real human being who did something real that I could understand.
I think it's quite an interesting thing that in all that exchanges that we had, Time Team, in a sense, was quite a revolutionary way of approaching history. I'd enjoyed watching people like Magnus Magnusson. There was a certain way in which you had a presenter, usually an academic, he would talk to people. Some of the BBC series is like Chronicle. What do you think it was about that early form of Time Team that changed things? Did you think it was a different way of presenting the past?
I think you've got to accept, first of all, that those people who were making television in the early 50s and early 60s, like Chronicle, like Mortimer Wheeler, like Glyn Daniel, who was another very great popularizer, not just the guys, the women as well. There were as many women, although they're not by and large nearly as celebrated like Chiquetta Hawkes. They were radical for their time. They sound really posh to us and really straight, but they were doing something that hadn't been done before. So in a way, I think, although what we were doing was radical, we were just receiving the baton from them. And I think one of the things about me as a presenter that you need to understand if you wanted to know why I do it in the way that it did is I never went to university. I left school with 4 O-levels. I've always wanted to be one of those clever people, but never have been. And I found this subject called archaeology, which is so arcane no one even knows how to spell it. And I thought, I want to be able to find a language to describe what goes on in that discipline, which people like myself can understand. And that's what I've always been driven by and still am. You might say I've got a great big lump on my shoulder, a bit of a chip, and I think you'd probably be right.
I think one of the things that was a relief for me, because to an extent I wasn't a historian either, was the reality in the trenches, as I think you said a few minutes ago, sometimes trumped the historical story. That ultimately, if we were digging a hole, I used to carry this phrase that, one sherd is worth several pages of history. And I loved the fact that you and I could be there when that tomb we found with a Roman burial, and the man's head was turned to one side, a Christian burial, and written on the stonework by his head was Viridius, a pagan god. Somebody back in the Roman period was trying to, keep both sides open. And I think the realities of that trench were a great relief for me. It wasn't about somebody's theory. We might be on hypothesis 5, 6, but when we were on a time team, you and I, particularly, I still have nightmares about this, wandering around, not being able to think we might find something. It was quite an edgy thing because we couldn't write the script for it. We literally didn't know what was going to be there. And did you experience that tension as well? Was that part of the...
Oh, enormously so. And I remember the first time actually we did a dig where we didn't find anything, and everyone was losing their bottle, including myself. And some wise head, it may have been you or it may not have been you, said, what is important about archaeology and what we're beginning to persuade our viewers of is that it's a forensic discipline. It's just like CSI. It's about pulling all the evidence together, and at the end of the day, you find something. Now, that's only real, it only has value if occasionally it doesn't work, if occasionally the clues are missing. Once people understand that, they'll buy the fact that occasionally you find something wonderful. But they've got to know that that doesn't always happen for it to be true. And I think that was always, as it were, the deal that there was between us and the audience. We might find nothing. And if not, you can still laugh at Phil. You can still get irritated with me. You can still be in awe of Carenza. All that happens. It's just that we didn't find what we were looking for.
And I can hear a slight Brummy accent floating into this conversation, which was Mick saying, whatever we're doing, it's about the archaeology, it's about the site, we're adding more information. We're not particularly here to find stuff at the end of the day or a villa. We're about going to a site and finding the reality of that site, and that's what matters.
Yeah, that's true. I can remember Francis saying to me once on a really desultory site, he said, this is great for archaeology. People have always wanted to know what was going on here. Now we know nothing. So that means that forever afterwards, people don't need to put resources into this area. Academically, we have done a great job.
And annoyingly, they had that thing about absence of evidence doesn't mean
Evidence
something.
Yeah. Just because she doesn't.
Basically mean because you found absolutely nothing is actually quite good news. And that drove me up the wall because, we would be hoping, I'd go with it because it was a test of our reality. But those were hard programs. I remember we dug, about 30 meters of trenches. It was like the Somme, and they had nothing in it. And it turned out to be one of our most popular programs, bizarrely enough.
Another of our most popular programs, of course, was the one where we found loads of stuff, but it was all fake. That had all been planted either by 19th century dotty-headed academics or else possibly by people very close to the people Allegedly. Who invited us in. And that became one of the most popular episodes to be shown in universities because it demonstrated that only by being rigorously scientific could we actually find out whether the stuff was of value or not, just the same as in CSI Miami.
Do you notice, like me, the way language is incorporated into this process of saying people think they've got something in part one? By part two, they're pretty sure they've got something. And part three, we've definitely got something. And yet, we both know there is hardly anything there. The evidence doesn't exist. And
it missed the final one. In the sum up at the very end of the program, we say, It may well be.
There's a distinct possibility, and you think, oh, go on, really? And I loved that. It seemed to me it was the Occam's razor. It was the point where archaeology said, if we can't prove it, we can't get our peers to agree to the evidence, we can't show it to people, it can't exist in the historical record in the way you want it to, regardless of how the story. We had a director one time who insisted that we follow the script, because in the script he was saying to me or you on day 2, you're supposed to have found the villa by now. So it's not here. Do you remember we went up to Scotland? We did an island in Scotland, and we were going to find an ancient building there that was the home of the Lords of the Isles.
Oh, yes.
Day 2, we found prehistoric archaeology, nothing to do with the Lords of the Isles. We found one harp pin, and then we celebrated by drinking Bunnahabhain whiskey on the Mound that was prehistoric, nothing to do with 2 months of research.
I remember another dig where we'd got, we brought in a load of, what do you call them, recreationists? No, what's the word?
Reenactors.
Yeah. I remember another one down in the southwest somewhere where we brought in a whole load of reenactors. I think they were Roman reenactors. They're all sitting around waiting for us to find the Roman stuff. And we never found any of it. Or we found Anglo-Saxon. And none of them have got any Anglo-Saxon costumes in the car. So we had to get rid of them all again.
Yes. Reenactment is a whole new subject of Time Team, which we might approach at another time. We've done recently some nice work with reenactors, and the bits I liked was when they reproduced the archaeology we then found in the trenches, and that was great, but that's another subject. I think that's been a lovely thing to go through some of those, so thank you very much for that. And it's interesting to think of that time passing and what we've discovered and what we're going to go on to discover. That's nice. Archaeology has a future.
Archaeology has a future because it constantly changes. We find more things, so every site becomes slightly more different. We have new technologies, so we can discover stuff that we hadn't discovered before. I think up until fairly recently, people thought that archaeology was static, that history was static. You know how people are freaking out now because we're suddenly saying, oh, actually, we had a colonial past. Actually, things were going on which weren't very pleasant to a whole lot of people who haven't really addressed in history before. Other people are saying, how dare you mess around with our history? Our history is what our history has always been. No, it isn't. History changes, archaeology changes. If you want to enjoy it, if you want to understand it, go with the flow.